something anyone can buy, and there are people out there who will buy it. People like us, who want a computer more than anything else. All the computers in the world seem to be locked up in enormous organizations, guarded by priests in white coats. I can end all that. Everyone can have their own machine. They can do anything they want with it. It'll be wonderful. I'll make it so cheap that no one can afford not to buy it. Eddie Curry thought that this was just another of Ed's crazy ideas. A complete computer. Only IBM did that. In fact, Ed Roberts had no idea how difficult the project was going to be. But he did have a brilliant starting point, the new 8080 chip from Intel. The chip was as powerful as the mainframes from a few years ago, and if he could only buy the chip cheaply enough, he was sure his plan would work. He phoned Intel. "How much do you want for the 8080? "They're worth $350 each. "That's too much," said Ed, "but I need a lot of chips. What would the price be for a big order?" "Well, how many chips do you need?" Eventually, Ed Roberts got the price down to $75 per chip, but only if he bought a very large quantity of chips. Of course, this meant that he could only save his business if he sold lots of the computers that he was going to build with the chip. And he needed more money before he could start. Ed went to his bank for a meeting late one night. He explained his plan to build and sell a personal computer. Finally, he said, "The question is, do I close down MITS or do you lend me $65,000? "How many machines will you sell in the first year?" asked the banker. 800, said Ed. "That sounds very optimistic." The bank manager was doubtful that Ed Roberts could sell very many personal computers, but he was persuaded by Ed's positive attitude, so Ed got his money and announced the Altair, and within a month he was getting 250 orders every day. It seemed there were lots of people like Paul Allen, Bill Gates, and Ed Roberts himself, people who wanted their own computer. In fact, some people were so enthusiastic that they camped outside Ed's factory while they waited for their Altairs. They were in love with the idea of personal computing. The Altair was named after a planet from the TV show Star Trek, and on paper it did sound like something from science fiction. A small, cheap computer that everyone could use in their own home. But in reality, the Altair could not do very much at all. It was not much like today's personal computers, PCs. There was no keyboard, no screen, and no printer. Programs were loaded bit by moving switches on the front of the machine. The results were shown by little lights that could be turned on and off. The memory was tiny, and there was no software at all. This was the perfect opportunity for Bill Gates and Paul Allen. To be useful, the Altair needed a programming language. Then users could write their own programs more easily. Bill Gates and Paul Allen told Ed Roberts that they could sell him one. In reality, the program largely existed in Bill and Paul's head. Even after they had written the software, they did not have a chance to run it on a computer before Paul went to New Mexico. When Paul arrived at MITS and met Ed Roberts for the first time, he was nervous. "I hope this works," he said. "So do I," said Ed. In fact, Paul thought that probably the program would not work, and he became even more nervous as all of the people at MITS gathered around him. He loaded the software onto the Altair, one instruction at a time. Every mistake meant that he had to start again. Finally, all of the instructions were loaded into the tiny computer's memory. Paul pressed the last switch and held his breath. It worked. Paul could hardly believe it. The program ran, and it could do some things that no one had ever seen on an Altair before. "You're hired. Finish the program and we'll sell it," said Ed Roberts. If the program had not worked, there might not be a Microsoft today. But Paul phoned Bill Gates in Harvard and told him, "Come on down, we've got a job." Bill came to New Mexico, and he and Paul lived across the street from MITS. Their apartment became very crowded because they hired some of their school friends to help them to finish the program. They all lived together with loud music playing most of the time. It was great fun, but Paul soon became worried that they would never finish the program. Bill always seemed to delay doing any work on the software. "Don't worry," said Bill. "I know how to write it. I have a design in my head. I'll get it done. Don't worry about it, Paul." But Paul was worried because he knew Bill was due to go back to Harvard soon. Bill was still a student, and the university had strict rules. Then 4 days before Bill had to leave, he moved to a hotel. No one saw him for the next 3 days. Then he returned with an enormous sheet of paper. "Here," said Bill to Paul, handing him the sheet. "What's this?" Paul asked. "It's the program." "The whole program?" "Yes." "You've written the whole thing in 3 days?" "Yes, and now I'm going back to school." It was one of the most amazing efforts of programming that Paul had ever seen. The basic program for the Altair was an enormous success, but not in a way that made Bill Gates and Paul Allen happy. Before it went on sale, it was copied by many Altair users, who then passed it on to their friends. There was no tradition of paying for software among computer engineers. Most of them did not think it was wrong to copy a good program, but to Bill and Paul, this copying was theft. Bill wrote a letter to a computer newspaper complaining about the copies. The letter soon became famous, and it caused a lot of anger among Altair users. It did not make many of them change their minds about copying software, but the letter did succeed in advertising the fact that Bill Gates and Paul Allen had written the best-known program for the new Altair. More work was sure to follow. Bill soon left Harvard, and Paul left his job as an engineer at Honeywell. They saw that even small computers, microcomputers, would need software, so they called themselves Microsoft. Their company would one day be more powerful than IBM. This was the beginning of a new industry. The Altair created great excitement among all the people like Ed Roberts who really wanted their own computer. But most of these people were already skilled engineers. Before computers could become truly popular, like cars or television, they also had to become something that anyone could use. This next step was achieved by Apple Computer. Apple Computer was the big success story of the computer industry in the 1970s. It took a product that was ugly, unfriendly, and difficult to use, and turned it into something that could be found beside televisions and radios in ordinary US homes. But this was never the intention of Steve Wozniak, who designed the first Apple computer. Computers were his hobby. Just like Bill Gates and Paul Allen, Steve fell in love with computers at school. When he was 13, he won a science competition by building a machine that was like a computer which could add and subtract. He also spent as much time as he could with real computers. He lived in Silicon Valley, California, the home of America's best technology companies. The engineers at these firms often allowed the teenage Wozniak to use their computers after work. Steve, usually called Woz, read computer books in the way that other children watched television. Every time a new machine was announced, he asked the company for the book that described it. Often the companies gave the book to him. He spent hours in class writing programs for machines he could never even touch. He was always inventing new programming tricks, clever ways to fit more and more instructions into a few lines of a program. He liked his programs to be as small and powerful as possible. Woz went to work for the Hewlett-Packard Computer Company, where he was very happy for a while. He also did some work for the video game company Atari, where his school friend Steve Jobs also worked. One evening, Woz was able to feed himself and a friend on free pizzas. He won them with high scores on a video game that he had designed himself. When the Altair appeared, Woz was just as excited as Bill Gates and Paul Allen. Although the Altair was much less powerful than the computers he worked with at Hewlett-Packard, he realized that this was the way to build his own computer. Woz had always carried around designs for computers in his head. But when he saw the Altair, he realized that his own personal computer did not need to be a big, expensive machine. The Altair proved that a real computer could be made from cheap, simple parts. Woz joined the Homebrew Computer Club. People met there to discuss the Altair and to show each other their programs and their designs for new machines. Woz made many friends at Homebrew. The atmosphere was enthusiastic and helpful. When Woz said that his bosses at Hewlett-Packard would not give him any chips, one of his friends brought a box of parts for him to the next Homebrew meeting. Woz began to design his own computer. He took many ideas from the Homebrew Club. All of the members of the club were very generous with information. Woz gradually built his computer, including all of the features that he learned about at the meetings. But the design was special. Where other people used 2 chips, Woz used just 1. Every part of his design was as efficient as possible. All the time I try to do designs that use fewer parts than anyone else, says Woz today. That's my puzzle. I always think, how can I do this faster or smaller or more cleverly? If a good answer to a problem uses 6 instructions, I try to do it using 5 or 3 or 2. I do tricky things that aren't normal. Every problem has a better solution when you start thinking of it differently. In the end, Woz had a computer that was as powerful as an Altair but used fewer parts. His friend Steve Jobs was very excited about it. Jobs was not as good an engineer as Woz, almost no one was, but he was a brilliant communicator. He was always full of energy and ideas. He decided that Woz's machine was going to change the world. Steve Jobs thought that he and Woz should start a business to sell the machine. At first, Woz was not interested. The computer was a hobby, not work to him. But Steve Jobs would not give up, and eventually Woz agreed. He sold his calculator, and Steve Jobs sold his Volkswagen bus. They used the money to start Apple Computer. Jobs chose this name because he had once had a job picking apples. The company's first factory was Steve Jobs's parents' garage. While Woz continued to improve his designs for the computer, Steve Jobs began to design a company. He saw from the start that computers could become part of ordinary life, but the company that achieved this would need to be a real company with professional managers and financial support. In fact, Steve Jobs was clever enough to see that he was not the right person to run a big computer firm. He had long hair and often did not wear shoes, so he was not likely to win the trust of banks and businessmen. But he persuaded experienced managers to join Apple. Soon the company, which had not actually sold anything yet, had a professional team of managers. It also succeeded in borrowing money to begin making computers. In January 1977, Apple moved to a small building in Cupertino, California. Woz worked on his new design, called the Apple II, while Steve Jobs organized every detail of the company. Apple employed fewer than 10 people, and some of them were still in school. But Jobs was so enthusiastic that everyone believed that this tiny company would change the world. "We're going to do it," Jobs would say. "We're going to build the best company in the world and make the best product that has ever been made." People at Apple often worked all day and all night. They were designing a very different computer to the machines that were already for sale. Steve Jobs wanted to sell computers to everyone, not just engineers. So it was important that the Apple II should look friendly and be easy to use. He hired an industrial designer who produced a smooth, narrow plastic case for the machine. At a time when most computers looked like scientific instruments, the Apple II was pale brown, and all of its screws were hidden. The Apple II was introduced in April 1977 at a trade fair in California. This was a very new idea. Before the Altair, no one paid to visit a computer show, but by the time of the fair, there were many thousands of people who wanted to find out more about this new hobby. At the trade fair, Apple Computer rented 2 of the best spaces near the entrance to the hall. The company also spent money to make sure that people noticed it. Almost all the other firms at the show used paper and glue to make their signs, but Apple paid for professional designers. Big, bright plastic signs showed the 6-color apple that represented the company. The first 4 Apple II computers were finished at 1 o'clock in the morning on the day the fair began. So many people came to the fair that it was difficult for anyone to move, but the first thing that everyone saw was Apple's shiny sign. Beneath the sign there was a clever video program running on an enormous screen. The trade fair's success showed everyone in the computer business that something new was happening. Computers were now more than just a hobby. They could soon be big business. Many companies would take advantage of the excitement about personal computing, but Apple was the most successful. Brilliant technology and a friendly design at a price many people could afford made Apple the star of this new industry. By the end of the summer, the company was selling equipment worth more than $250,000 each month. In 5 years, Apple Computer was valued at $1 billion. There were soon hundreds of programs for the Apple II. Many of them were games or other types of software that were designed to be fun. But then, 1 year after the computer went on sale, a new program appeared. It was called VisiCalc. It was the world's first electronic spreadsheet. Suddenly, people who worked in finance, in fact anyone who worked with numbers or money, had a new tool. Dan Bricklin was one of VisiCalc's inventors, and he soon found that he was being treated like a pop star. "You've changed my life," many people said to him. One man began to shake when Dan showed VisiCalc to him. "That's what I do all week," he said. "I could do it in an hour with this program." Many people just reached into their pockets and offered Dan money as soon as they saw the software. VisiCalc was the first serious business program for a personal computer. Soon it began to frighten the most powerful company in the computer industry, IBM. When the Apple II had come onto the market, IBM was not worried. The Apple seemed like a toy. It did not seem to threaten the billion-dollar business of selling mainframes to the world's largest companies. This was a market that IBM understood completely. Big business wanted powerful computers that never broke down, and it did not care that each machine cost $100,000. But VisiCalc changed that. People who had to queue for time on an IBM mainframe were suddenly freed by VisiCalc. Why wait days for your answers when an Apple II and VisiCalc could supply them in seconds? Many business people bought an Apple computer simply because they wanted to use the new software. This was also the time when the banking and insurance industries were changing in the USA and Britain. New laws meant that the world of finance was much more competitive. People could not afford to wait for time on an IBM mainframe. Waiting was not just annoying, it could also mean that you went out of business. By 1979, IBM could not ignore Apple. There were suddenly tens of thousands of people buying Apples, and they were very happy with them. In fact, they loved them, and they took them to the engineering departments of IBM's customers. "I'm using my Apple because you can't do the job on the mainframe," they said. IBM knew that it had to do something. It was losing the hearts and minds of its customers. But it could not act quickly. It was famous for slow, careful work. It had a fixed system for designing new products. Every decision about the design was checked by many managers. Every part of a new machine was tested many times. All of the checks and tests were intended to make sure that IBM machines almost never broke down.